Hello, and welcome to the Quest for Significance podcast, where we talk about a basic human need that all of us should know about, but not everyone seems to realize, and that is we're on a quest for significance, respect, dignity. Hey, for some people, it seems like that's mostly money and awards and titles and all that, but there's so many ways to gain significance. And we also write about how it can be dangerous when you lose significance. I'm Dan Raviv. I was a network news correspondent for many years, and so I covered significant events and a lot of people who were seeking significance. Now I want you to meet my co-author and our guest in this episode of the Quest for Significance podcast. There's Dr. Arie Kruglanski. He's a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland, an expert on human motivation, and kind enough to invite me to co-author this book, The Quest for Significance by Kruglanski and Raviv. And there is our guest, Dr. Michele Gelfand. You teach at the Stanford University School of Business. I want to get these titles right, where you're a professor of cross-cultural management and professor of organizational behavior. And I know that you really pride yourself on considering different cultures, and I know that Arie Kruglanski and I totally love that. You had a breakthrough book just a few years ago that absolutely touches on that, called Rule Breakers, it's Makers First. Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, right. And it's about the difference between tight cultures and loose cultures. Now, not everybody knows those terms, but we're about to, of course. And Arie Kruglanski, I know you're very familiar with Michele Gelfand's work, and so I'm really wondering how this notion of tight societies and loose societies, can overlap with your work and what we wrote about, which is the quest for significance.
Yes, very much so. The quest for significance is the quest to have value, to have social worth. And social worth is derived from values, societal values. If you represent, affirm, serve a social value, you gain significance by dint of serving that value. And now Michele's groundbreaking work on tight societies and loose societies basically talks about norms, to the extent to which norms that contain values are important in a society, to the extent that they are salient, to the extent that people are orienting themselves to those values. So it would make sense that societies that are tight, where norms are extremely tight, if you deviate from norms, you're going to be severely punished. If you adhere to norms, you're going to be rewarded. Those norms would play a role in people's quest for significance. In societies that are more relaxed about norms, more relaxed about social values, perhaps people concerned about significance might be less. But this is my hypothesis, but I'd like to hear about that from the expert, the world expert on tightness and looseness, my very good friend and also cousin, Professor Michele Gelfand.
Thank you so much. It's just so great to be here. And thank you for putting this together. It's just a great, incredible podcast of trying to bring in different angles of all things significant. So I'm really pleased to be here. Just by way of introduction, I'm a cross-cultural psychologist, which means that I study how behavior is universal or culture-specific around the globe. And you can think about culture as a fractal pattern from the nation all the way down to the neuron. And culture is a very interesting puzzle because it's omnipresent. It's all around us 24/7. But it's something we take for granted. We don't really think about it. You can think about the times when you've started to realize that, wow, the way that I think about the world, the values I have, the norms I abide by, you start realizing, what they are when you get outside of your cultural bubble. T.S. Eliot actually said it very nicely. He said, by the time you've done all your exploring and you come back to the place, you actually know it for the very first time. So it's really kind of a very interesting sort of puzzle that something's omnipresent all around you, but it's something we don't think about or take for granted. So I want to say that I think what's so exciting about significance theory, quest theory, and culture is that there's many different ways in which we can think about this. And I want to highlight a couple of ways in which I think they intersect. I will say that I don't often think things are universal. Like there's so much assumption of universals out there in psychology that people don't test. But I do actually think this is a good candidate. for universality, that universally, we all desire to be respected, to matter. And that's a public kind of really pursuit. It's not just what I see myself as, but how I'm seen in the eyes of others. So I think it's a good candidate for universal. I want the check in the mail from you, Dr. Kruglanski.
Well, by the way, Michele Gelfand, I'm very relieved to hear that as well, because of course this is all new to me as a journalist, and I learned, with every page that we wrote, in the quest for significance, I was learning, and I was struck by the notion that people in different environments or domains or countries or societies define what they're after differently, and it can be,
yes.
it can be, as I mentioned earlier, money, fame, fortune, or just trying to be the
Yeah.
best whatever. And you've decided in your writing, in your book Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, to give us just two categories: tight and loose. So I was struck by that, but you're willing to admit that everyone seeks significance in some way.
Well, yeah. And I think the question then, and then I'll get into how it varies across cultures, because there's very important ways in which it varies. So if something can be both universal and also have deep culture specificity. So I want to highlight how culture affects what makes you significant, the range at which we can sort of are operating within the quest for significance, how tight or loose we're allowed to pursue different sources of significance, how contagious significance is across individuals varies a lot across cultures, both significance gain and significance loss. And then I want to highlight a couple of interesting issues around the interface of what happens when people from different cultures come together. But I want to just highlight that one really important question, I think, for Arie and the whole team of SQ theory is, why might it be universal? And my hypothesis would be that when we think about evolution, and I am firmly a cross-cultural psychologist who thinks about history and ecology, why certain values and norms evolve to make sense, to help people adapt to their environments. I think that when you think about, life thousands of years ago, when we lived in small groups, when there was a threat of ostracism and gossip that kept people to be behaving themselves, to be part of the group and not try to steal resources in contexts where there was a lot of danger, a lot of threat, that in fact, the idea that we desire for respect and the consequences of not having that could be very, very important in those areas, those times. And it's just something that has become sticky over the centuries, that it's a human motive that evolved because of our ecology and our history. So I think, and the kind of group living that we did. So I do think that has to be tested. As a cross-cultural evolutionist, we create a lot of computational models, as well as do other work, lab and field and neuroscience, where we try to test the assumption. But I'm going to bet some money that there was some adaptive value that made significance a very important value universally. But we can get some grant money, maybe not. But I do want to say that, to your point around, the content of significance varies a lot around the world. It can be universal, but the values that we're socialized to achieve, what Shalom Schwartz calls guiding principles in our lives, are really where it's going to be the local nature of what we're pursuing. And that varies a lot across cultures. In the US, for example, we've done a lot of work on the nature of individualism in the US. We're not just a culture that prioritizes the self and independence. We also prioritize competition. So we're very vertical and individualistic in the US compared to, let's say, Scandinavia or Australia, New Zealand, where it's very much about independence, but much more flat, much more about being equal, not standing out. They call it the tall poppy syndrome in Australia, where these are very different species of individualism. But the point being is that means that in the US, we're taught from a very early age that what's really important is how much you stand out, how much you're basically achieving something vis-a-vis other people. And that's a huge source of our significance. So much so that we work to live. People tell us, you Americans are crazy. You don't relax enough, because our source of significance is very much tied to the values of vertical individualism. Other cultures prioritize very different values for different reasons. Scandinavian culture is very much focused, many contexts, on nature, on engagement with nature, protection of nature. And you might be seen as worthy of respect if you're going out to your Swedish stuga, your house in the countryside, and actually spending time in the outdoors. Other cultures, of course, value family and in-group harmony, like in East Asia, and that might be the source of significance. So I want to be clear that it can be very universal, but we're taught through our teachers, our parents, our institutions, what counts and what doesn't count. And so that's one way we could think about this.
Could I have a brief layman's question? The layman has a question just for some viewers and listeners who may not know. Which type is tight and loose?
Well, we're going to come back to that because actually we can think about the content of values informing what we're aiming for. But some cultures are very tight in the sense that they define what's important and you have to really follow those rules. Other cultures have a lot more latitude, what's permissive. So even in the US, even if the dominant value has to do with achievement, there's a lot of different ways you can become significant in the US because it's a loose culture. We don't necessarily follow any very strict norms as compared to, let's say, in Germany or Japan. So actually, tightness is independent of these values. It actually amplifies the importance of those values. And there's a lot of research that shows that in tighter cultures, you really have to focus on the norms and you have to abide by those norms lest you are punished in either indirect or direct ways. Loose cultures, you're much more likely to act on your own internal values, whatever they are. You don't have to pay attention to norms as much. So that gives you more latitude. It gives you actually more multi-finality, as Arie would call it, in goal systems theory. It gives you a lot of different ways you can be significant. So I think that's really how I think about them. And I want to get to other aspects of culture that also are very important for the understanding of significance. But Arie, I saw you had a question.
Yes, I just want to tie things up, the things that you said about the evolution of this quest for significance. When we lived in small groups way back then, it was important to serve the group because the group was in danger. And if you serve the group, you attain significance. So that led to the evolution of this quest for significance.
Yes.
But kind of to serve the group existentially in protecting it through its enemies. But over time, other values, not just serving the group per se, but other values developed in the group and therefore serving those values. For example, serving, being concerned about nature, or being concerned about wealth, or being concerned about family, evolved. And I think that your work is very important in explaining how different cultures evolve different values.
Yeah.
It started with just protecting the group, but then it was not just protecting the group, but abiding by the group's values that evolved based on the context, the historical,
that's right,
geographical context. So can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point because every time we talk about some psychological theory like significance quest, we have to think about why did it evolve? What was adaptive about it or quasi-adaptive to it? And I think there's a good segue because, as I mentioned, I think significance quest is universal, but the desire for respect and the need for respect is actually pronounced in some cultures over others. There's some cultures that emphasize it much less. And it has an evolutionary basis. And we actually, the whole literature on this is called the evolution of honor cultures. Honor has a very close connection to significance quest in the sense that it's about the amount that others respect you, that you have worth in the eyes of others. So there's very close connection between the two theories. And what we know about honor cultures is that, well, I'll just back up and say it's about self-worth. How do we gain our self-worth? In some cultures, your sense of self-worth is negotiated constantly. It could be gained, it could be lost, and it could be stolen even. You're constantly thinking about this currency of how much am I being respected, and it's highly negotiable. Other cultures, what Dov Cohen and Dick Nisbet call dignity cultures, which is essentially the US and some other Western cultures, people think about self-worth as a skeleton. Like you're born with a sense of self-worth. And yeah, people can insult you or they can disrespect you, but it kind of can slide off of you. It's not something that actually steals your sense of self-worth, lowers it or not. And it turns out that there's an evolutionary basis of why some cultures emphasize honor. It turns out that when you have contexts where there's weak institutions, the police don't respond, they're unreliable in terms of protecting people when they're being aggressed against. In those contexts also, when you have a lot of resource scarcity where people can steal your resources that speak to survival, those are contexts where the evolution of the importance of your reputation for being respected is very critical. And the idea is that, for example, in herding economies that had weak institutions where you're just dealing with livestock and moving around, there were a lot of opportunistic people in these populations that would try to steal your resources. So having a reputation for being respected for your strength, or for women having respect for being modest, actually helped to curtail that aggression. And again, this is a currency. They say in Arabic that, it's respect is more important than bread. It's more important than money. And in fact, it was important because if you had a reputation for being strong and having garnered a lot of respect in your community, people would not aggress against you. And in fact, that makes it quasi-adaptive. Now, with that said, evolution can have mismatches. These days, even in contexts where there are strong institutions, we still have honor kind of holdovers from many, many centuries ago, like in the US South. As an example, Dan, I'm not sure you've seen these studies, but in the US South, Dove Cohen did these very funny experiments where he brought people into the lab and brought US Northerners and Southerners, males, into the lab. And he calls this the asshole study, because what he did was he had people walking down the hallway going to a study, these men, and a Confederate, a person who wasn't really a person, but just acting for the experiment, bumped into the subjects, the male from the South or the North, and then called them an asshole, said, "Oh, you asshole." And they actually then measured the amount of testosterone projection and cortisol stress response that these Southern and Northern males had in this situation. And then they actually looked at, to the point of like, this is a significance loss. Someone just called me an asshole. They looked at how they aggressed against other people in the lab. And so this is something that is, you could see, becomes ingrained. It becomes under our skin. And I mention this because it's important these days in honor cultures, which you see in the Middle East, in the US South, and some parts of Eastern Europe, that we still see this idea that you need to be respected. And I'm very hypersensitive to any indications that you didn't respect me, because it could have implications for other people really messing with me, is really alive and well. And I will say one more thing about this, which is that it becomes very contagious. My sense of respect is also contagious to my brothers, to my family, to my cousins. That means that when I gain significance, it's also spreading to my group. But when I lose it, it also spreads to the group. That means that others can be responsible for trying to get my significance back. And in fact, I can tell you, I'll open up for questions, but I've just recently published a neuroscience paper on revenge that looked at how revenge becomes contagious in the brain when people insult each other. This is a study done in China. So this is just to say that we can think about significance theory as universal in some very broad way, but there are certain contexts that are emphasized in certain cultures, and also some cultures emphasize it a lot more. And it's very important to be constantly on guard for significance gain and loss.
So my big question to you, Michele, is whether do you think that tight cultures that make the norms very, very salient would instill in people greater sensitivity to significance, to honor, than loose cultures?
Well, that's a great question. I would say that all honor cultures are tight, but not all tight cultures are honor cultures. So think about contexts like Germany, Austria, Switzerland. They tend to lean tighter. They're also individualistic. This sort of gets at the distinction between collectivism and tightness. They're correlated, but they're distinct. You can have cultures that are very individualistic and tight, like Switzerland, Austria, Germany. And you can have cultures that are collectivistic and tight. We find them in Japan and China. You can have individualistic cultures that are loose, like the US, but also you can have collectivist cultures that are loose, like in Latin America or Italy, for example. So I don't think there's a direct main effect on how important significance is in terms of some contents. But what tight cultures do is they make you more accountable to those sources of significance. So tightness is about felt accountability. It's about being watched and being evaluated and having some punishments potentially from that. That's what we mean by accountability. Loose cultures have less accountability. So if you're not doing the significance thing that has been sort of heroized and moralized, you can still actually live a pretty good life, right? You can find your own ways to be significant. There's a lot more latitude on how you achieve it. So that's how I would think about it.
So, which brings me to a follow-up question. Would you say that the tight cultures are primarily prevention focused, that people are trying to prevent deviating from the norms, but not so much promotion focused because they want to stay as close to the norm as possible?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, we have evidence that would show that when you're in a tight context, whether it's a tight nation or think about tight occupations, like if you're in like medicine or you're in manufacturing or in airlines, like these are contexts where making mistakes have a lot of consequence. In fact, we have a new rank order of occupations in terms of tight loose. and consequence of error is very important. And so you're not going to start promoting all sorts of stuff in that context. You need to make sure that you are preventing making mistakes. And that leads to the kind of broader thought about this, is that tightness evolves in context where there's a need for coordination, when there's a need to respond to collective threat like disasters or invasions, or in the context of industries, like when there's a lot of potential safety issues. So tightness evolves in context where there's threat, whether it's real or imagined. And by the way, I was going to mention just something about this idea of honor cultures. I think it's really something we can see now playing out in politics also. Because if you look at this spat between Elon Musk and Trump recently, as in the last couple of days, in many cases, this is an honor fight. This is a significance quest fight between, it's really promoting this notion of masculinity and toughness that, again, is derived through a theory about honor. And much of what I think we're seeing here is actually what's interesting in challenging institutions, because the honor culture is not really necessarily about having strong institutions. It's actually pushing back on institutions because there's a certain code that people are really more informal code people are abiding by, which is loyalty, which is giving me respect. It's not about this kind of abstract impersonal institutions. So it's actually something I think we should write about together, because there's very interesting kind of, I also talk about weak institutions affording honor cultures, but honor cultures and people that have been prioritizing that mindset probably push back a lot on institutions, because the fact is that the stronger the institutions, the less we need honor cultures per se to evolve. Dan, wow. I see you.
Well, I'm a newsman, so just thinking about, as you say, the recent spat between Trump and Elon Musk makes me think, of course, that both of them have money, which gives them a huge trumpet, to amplify their views, their claims really to honor. I got that. Everyone can behave like that. We're noticing them, right, because of their positions and their money.
Yeah.
But lots of people can behave that way.
Yes, absolutely. And, I will say also, this relates to some recent research we just published on, I think, really deeply connected to significance quest theory, which is on proving yourself in these contexts, whether it's because of money or whatnot status or otherwise, makes it such that you're very salient. It's very salient to not want to lose that status. And in fact, what we find is that people are much less likely to apologize when there's an honor culture that's being activated. We have a whole paper on like U.S. senators from the last 50 years. How many people apologize in the Senate and Congress? And we trace it back to their state, which we now have an honor index for. The idea is that when you apologize, you're potentially losing significance. You're potentially losing status. So actually, these spats also can escalate, because we know from conflict resolution theory that the way you de-escalate a conflict, you try to bring it back to interest. You try to say, hey, I apologize. Let's come back and talk about how we can solve this problem. And what we see here is very, I would say, I'll predict that there's been very little apologizing among our president because of the significance loss that goes along with that. Now, I will say that in this study, and then Arie, I see you, we both are very fast talkers. In this study, we also then did something at the very end of the package, which we said, hey, maybe we can give people alternative sources of how to be significant. Because actually, in honor cultures, there's this quest to be very strong, the virility, but there's also the norm for virtue, to be virtuous, to be dutiful, and be kind and generous. And so when we actually switch the frame, we tell people, look, the norm here is, don't forget, is moral integrity, is virtue. When we actually help people to think about honor in that way, they apologize just as much. So it's just mainly when people are like really thinking about virility and strength and their reputation, then we see a lack of apologizing. But when we switch the frame, because honor is a very complex construct, to being about moral virtue, we see as much apologizing. So just FYI, there's some like really interesting nuances around it.
I want to go back to one extremely intriguing point that you made: the relation between institutions and honor cultures. When the institutions are weak, honor cultures tends to develop. But the opposite is also interesting, that when people have a very strong honor orientation, the institutions are cramping their styles.
Yeah.
And they want to disregard institutions. And we very much in connection with Trump and with Musk, right? They
Yeah.
disinstitute it. They don't regard constitution.
Yes.
They want to do, because
Yeah.
of their great orientation, they want to prevail.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, I think this is precisely like a lot of times when we think about causality in our psychological science or any science, we think about one direction. So I've been studying this, including in computational models where we look at the evolution of honor agents. But now I started thinking about the reverse causality. Wait a second. When you're in an honor mentality, those institutions are really kind of cramping your style. And I think we should get some data on this because I think it's really the moment that we're dealing with, even the news moment, Dan, to your point.
At the risk of distracting from that, current events and valuable insight, I don't want to forget to ask you, Professor Gelfand, about conflict cultures that I know you have studied. Now, by the way, should I be thinking that we're talking about broken states like Libya and Afghanistan, or not necessarily? It could be, in fact, a city in a country that's had some major problems. So, conflict culture, an example or two, and what have you found?
Sure. This is precisely like the idea of like, how do you manage conflict? What are the norms around managing conflict? I started thinking about this because we think about conflict management at the individual level. Like, are you an avoider? Are you a competitor? Are you someone that tries to be an integrator? Like, there's a lot of theory and research on that. And in fact, I was at a faculty meeting in our department years ago. I'm not going to say who was chair at the time, but I was looking around the room thinking, wow, like I know a lot of people here in this room have a lot of very integrative conflict styles, but why is this culture avoidant? Like, why are we not talking about stuff that we need to talk about? And I started thinking in a faculty meeting, because faculty meetings are kind of boring, just FYI. So I started thinking about research, and I was outlining this like multi-level theory of what is the leader's conflict style, and how is that affecting the whole norms around conflict management, and what is the industry, and what are the people attracted to this organization in the first place? So I wound up publishing and doing a lot of research on this construct, but you can think about this in terms of different types of conflict cultures. One is avoidant. Others are very dominating, like truth wins, people constantly fighting on the surface. Actually, I get to think that's my New York kind of conflict culture. My husband's from the Midwest, very avoidant. My kids are bicultural on conflict styles. And then there's, kind of passive aggressive conflict cultures. So there's all sorts of different types of cultures. I do think, as I mentioned, that cultures where there's a lot of at stake for your status, these dominating cultures where there's a lot of status conflicts, you might find more significance quest conflicts in those contexts. So there's in avoidant context, you might have it or passive aggressive, but they're happening behind the surface. So it's really about how do we think about the norms around us and how we manage conflict and how it affects our expressions and conflicts over significance.
Sadly, our time is up. Wow. But you know what they say in all contexts of education, entertainment, and the mix between them, right? Leave them wanting some more. And so, among other things, I mentioned Michele Gelfand's book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. You are a member, by the way, of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is a really big deal. I know that, in your wonderful world of academe. And of course, I have to say to the audience, this podcast is called The Quest for Significance because it is inspired by the book, The Quest for Significance, which I hope some of you will enjoy as well. Michele Gelfand from Stanford University in California, Arie Kruglanski, who teaches at the University of Maryland in College Park. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
It was a great pleasure, as always.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.